It's been almost 2 years now that we have been head down trying to focus on, keep up with, or ignore in some cases what AI means for and what role it's playing in AI. And I have so appreciated the conversations that I've been a part of and heard and have had over the past 2 years with all of you, and thinking about how do we incorporate this to continue to do our best for our students. On that note, over the past year, Candles and the Red House have launched the initiative on the pedagogical uses of artificial intelligence with over 17 projects that we supported this year and 23 fellows. You can browse posters that describe their projects. It is across a wide range of schools and disciplines, and gives you a sense of the kinds of thinking that our colleagues are engaged with as they wrestle with AI in research, in curriculum design, course design, assignment design. We also have a summer round going on that we'll be able to report on shortly, and then will be another round in the fall, so keep an eye out for that. And if you are interested in getting in on the summer funding, please let us know. It's IPAI. So on that note, here to share some thoughts and to have a conversation with us about the role of AI in education and AI overall are Candles Executive Director Eddie Maloney and Cal Newport, a professor of computer science at Georgetown. They'll begin with a conversation, and we'll very quickly move into a Q&A because there have been such incredible questions in every session I've been in. The time has been the cutoff, not the lack of questions. So please, we'll have runners with microphones, so just raise your hand and we'll invite them to join in the thinking that you are doing. So to the speakers, I hope all of you know Eddie Maloney, the Executive Director of Candles. He's also a professor in the Department of English. Fun fact, I was his TA many, many moons ago. As founding director of the program in learning design and technology, he works with students in a variety of ways to engage in a critical study of higher ed through the lenses of learning design and technology. He's the author of 2 books, Learning and Innovation in the Future of Higher Education and the Low Density University 15 Scenarios for Higher Education. Another fun fact, his favorite Marvel character is Captain America. Cal, we'll have to follow up with you in the Q&A about that. Cal Newport is an associate professor of computer science at Georgetown. His scholarship focuses on the theory of distributed systems, while his general audience writing explores intersections of culture and technology. He's the author of 8 books, including most recently Slow Productivity, which will be available to win at this year's book raffle event, A World Without Email, Digital Minimalism, and Deep Work. These titles include New York Times bestsellers and have been published in 40 languages. Newport is also a contributing writer for The New Yorker and the host of Deep Questions podcast. So get your questions ready, and without further ado, welcome to our speakers.
TA ever, I think.
No, Eddie, we're going to do about 20 minutes on Captain America.
I actually didn't know that was my favorite character, but
I think a chat bot told us that about you. That's
makes sense. So like Chris Evans might be my favorite version. It's great to see you all, Cal. Thanks so much for being here. Molly, thanks for the introductions. We really do want this to be a conversation, so I'm going to ask a couple of questions just to get us started, but we have mics, as Molly mentioned, roaming, so as soon as we kind of work through a couple of initial questions, we'd love you to engage and to raise things that you're interested in. As Molly mentioned, we had a ton of questions that came in during registration, and so we're happy to ask those questions for you, but we'd much more prefer if you could join us in this conversation. So Cal, just maybe as a way of getting started, in April 2023, you wrote an article for The New Yorker called What Kind of Mind Does ChatGPT Have? Having watched the recent releases from OpenAI on ChatGPT 4.0 for Omni, whatever they're calling it, it's quite impressive. Maybe I should have said my favorite Marvel character was Black Widow, but as a Scarlett Johansson fan, I'm curious what you what you think the mind of AI is today, and what does it look like? Is it different than it was a year ago, or how should we think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So that was a hard article to write, right? So the charge with that article last April was to try to explain the computer science behind a large language model. In this case, it was GPT 3.5, without using a single technical term. This was sort of the rule at the New Yorker is if David Rimnick doesn't know the term, you're not allowed to use it. And it turns out he doesn't know any mathematical terms. I thought vector was a well-known term, or matrix. No. And since then, so I had a new article come out a few months ago where I was really going deep on GPT-4. So how did this change? And my very short version of this is it's doing the same thing, but better. And what I mean by that, so what is the thing that a language model like the GPT family is actually doing? Well, we know it's a token predictor. You give it text as input, and it outputs a single token, which is sort of a word or a piece of a word that it feels like will extend that input text in a way that makes sense. And the way you build very large responses, it's called autoregression, but you take the output, you add it to your input. Now your input's slightly longer. You feed that through the model, you get another token, you add that on, you feed that through the model. Every time you do this, it is de novo computation. There's sort of no memory or state that's kept. It's just the input. The same model sees the input every time. And what happens in these models essentially is you can imagine there's two things happening. It's looking at the words that are in the input, the relevant words, and it figures out here's a bunch of tokens or words that might make sense grammatically to follow next. And then there's this huge sequence of pattern recognizers and rules that look for properties in the text, and they put them through rules to help figure out which of these words we should choose. GPT-4 just made that collection of pattern recognition and rules much larger, right? So it's the same architecture. They just made it much bigger. They went from something like the order of hundreds of billions, low hundreds of billions of parameters, the main thing we use to describe the size of these models, to probably around 1 trillion parameters. So they just made it bigger. And now suddenly, in just solving this game of spitting out tokens, these rules could encode reasoning and logic and models of complicated or abstract concepts. So it's sort of really interesting what it's doing. But the main thing they changed is they made it bigger. So I think my conclusions from that article maintain, right? We shouldn't see this in the same way we think of like a human intelligence, because there's no state, there's no interactivity. There's nothing that changes in the definition of the model as it processes the information. It's all static and feed forward, but it can now do pretty amazing things. The latest intel I've heard on this is the model's being trained right now. So the successors, the GPT-4, is probably going to be on order of about $1 billion of computation time to train. GPT-4 probably cost around $100 million to train. There's 2 or 3 models being trained right now that are on the scale of $1 billion plus. So they're ratcheting up the size yet again, but they're still not significantly changing how these things operate. Right now, the game has been larger, larger, larger.
Absolutely fascinating. The idea that there is no states is really interesting for the work that we're doing, right? That there's no memory in these systems because we think iteratively, right? We process and we continue to build on. So what do you think that means for, how students are using it and how we're kind of understanding its role in higher ed, that it really is only processing in the moment?
Yeah, I mean, because this is the way human cognition works is we maintain state, we build models of things, and then we express them, right? So, if I'm generating a sentence about something, I'm much more likely to build an internal representation of what I want to say inside of my head, and then at a first order of approximation, and then describing this thing I created in my head, which is not what a model does. A model just, here's my input, let me figure out the next word, and then I'm done. And then it's the exact same model we use with no state kept to do it again. What's going to get interesting in pedagogy, but with these models in general, a big prediction of mine, just based on covering this field, is we're going to see much more of a shift towards ensembles of models, right? It is a terribly inefficient way to do things like reasoning or planning, to just build a giant token predictor and hope that as a side effect in getting really good at predicting tokens in some sort of hard to interpret way, logic and reasoning rules get baked into it. I think what we're going to see more in the future is actually the language models getting smaller, And they're going to interact with other models that are much more bespoke for doing specific type of reasoning, where you have state, where you're maybe looking in the future to plan something, where you have a hardwired qualitative functions. This is good, this is bad, this is what we're trying to do, this is what we're not trying to do. That's where we're going to see, I think, these models open up beyond just text production to doing a lot of other things. But for students right now, the thing they care about typically is text production. That's why higher ed is really ground zero for language model disruption. I mean, if we're honest, all of these stories of disruption that followed the ChatGPT release in late 2022, few of them have yet come to pass, right? It turns out that the shortcoming of having to interact through a chat interface and paste things into there, it's not grafting seamlessly enough on all these other types of work we do. The exception is students. Because what do we do as students if not be given some sort of implicit prompt in response to we produce text? So really students have become, higher ed has become ground zero for what happens. How is this disruption going to play out in other fields as well? So it's interesting. We're in the cutting edge seat right now. It's a good news and bad news, but we're at the cutting edge.
I mean, it's one of the things that's fascinating me about that model that you just described of a smaller LLM working with other models is in some ways that's how we see students using the tools right now, not necessarily with different models, but with different ways of prompting. So I think when we started, the concern was that, or when this became an important part of our consideration as we were thinking about its impact on higher ed, is that students would simply put in a prompt, get an essay out, and turn that essay in. It's what I call a kind of transactional use of AI. And that's really changed. Our students are using this in more sophisticated ways, more complex ways. They're using it as if it has different services or different tools at different times, right? Is that kind of what you're seeing?
I mean, because I've spent the last month or two for an article I'm writing, just watching students or reading transcripts of students writing papers with ChatGPT. And it's been really interesting to see what this really means. And so you're absolutely right. The only cases I'm finding in this research of students just producing text from scratch, not touching it and submitting it, are assignments they know the professor's not going to read. So it's typically reading response assignments. If it's write a paragraph to prove you did the reading, they're like, yeah, okay, we can generate that because no one's going to read it. Otherwise, you know, I was just reading yesterday, I read through the 12,000 word transcript of a master's student at Oxford writing a very complicated paper on perspectivism and how it applies potentially to sort of indigenous peoples of South America. It's a very complicated article. He did many things with this model. None of them was, hey, can you write like a large section of the paper? One of the things he would do is he would give it his own paragraphs a lot. Hey, I wrote this already, but can you rewrite it? And then it would rewrite it and it would be worse. And then he would start asking it, well, can you, this sentence here, can you give me like a better sentence to follow it? There's this weird sort of wordsmithing back and forth. He would also have it, he would give it articles and say, can you give me the 10 main points in this essay that someone else wrote? Okay. Point number 3, like, can you outline that in the 5 smaller points? All right, can you write me like an outline then for like a section that would make those points, but not this point? So there's that interaction. He was also using it to test ideas, which was interesting, right? He would say, do you buy this? Like this argument, here's a paragraph I just wrote. Do you buy this argument? Do you buy this analysis? And all throughout this, and this came up in a lot of students I observed, he talked to it like a person. I would say a non-trivial fraction of the students I observed had names for the model that they would use when they were referring to it. This student volunteered how this model was like a very good conversational partner for him. So there's something really interesting going on in this sort of cybernetic essay composition process that is very different than we thought it was going to be. It's not, can you do this work for me? It's this interactive process that honestly, in many cases, seems like it's taking a lot more time than if they just done the writing in the first place. Like it's not an efficiency play necessarily. There's a stress reduction play to it. There's an anxiety of the blank page play to it. I think there's a somewhat of a lessening of just the mental strain of it's just me and I'm writing from scratch. And when you can have these interactions, even if they're not really giving you much, it allows you to offload stuff out of your working memory, to pull it back. So there's also some sort of cognitive story going on here that is reducing the experience strain of producing prose. Anyways, I'm still up to my neck in these transcripts, but it's a richer, more complicated picture of human tool symbiosis than I sort of expected going into it.
And a different kind of value, right? So if you thought the value was just efficiency, if there's a value actually in helping the students think about what writing is and to do better work with these tools rather than to do something that's replacing their work, right? I think was probably the biggest concern that we have. So maybe this leads to kind of where you are now. You just went on a book tour of your latest book, Slow Productivity. I'm curious how you see the effect of AI on productivity. You wrote during in Slow Productivity, you wrote that during the pandemic, our sense of productivity changed, especially for knowledge producers. Are you seeing this relationship, this dynamic changing since then and with AI?
So the issue is what's happening now with language models and knowledge work productivity. In particular, like what people care about is more of the administrative overhead. You know, of course, everyone here has a lot of administrative overhead. To what degree can AI help with that to maybe clear more time for more of the sort of more contemplative or high skill behaviors that we do? Right now, the play is using language models to make admin overhead faster, which is not something I tend to be super optimistic about. It's like, I have to send this email anyways, but the language model might help me write a draft of it faster. Or I have to outline, take the main points from this meeting and send them around. And the language model can help me do that faster. Historically, when we look at the intersection of technology and knowledge work productivity, basically every innovation of the front office PC revolution, every time we make an administrative task faster, we just do more tasks. Right? So like into the slipstream of speeding it up just comes a lot more things. So I tend not to be as optimistic about, hey, if you can help me write my email faster, that's going to matter. What I care about, like what would actually have a footprint is more of the removal of certain administrative overhead entirely off of your plate, right? So not, can you help me write this email faster, but can you prevent me from having to see or reply to that email in the first place? Which I do say, I mean, I came out and said, like, this is the Turing test we should care about, is can you clean my email inbox? Like that is actually like a Rubicon of AI that is going to be really consequential for the knowledge sector when it's crossed. What we need to do that is going to be this ensemble model. So I wrote this piece a few months ago where, you know, it's well known within the AI community that what language models cannot do is plan. Because they're feed-forward networks, right? You put an input, it goes through, patterns are recognized, rules are applied, and a guess comes out the other end. There's no interactivity, right? It can't simulate possibilities. It can only go through pre-programmed plans. So anything that requires simulating possible futures to decide what to do next, which is a big part of our cognition, a static language model can't do that. You need a model that can loop and be interactive. It's why when we beat chess players with AIs, those chess AIs simulate a lot of moves. When we beat Go players with AI, the Go AI simulates lots of moves. Like, what if we did this? What if they did this? So the future, I think, of AI having a big footprint on knowledge work productivity is going to be when we have these ensemble models, a language model that understands what we're saying, but then another model that can, for example, simulate the other parties in a communication and sort of understand their intentions and sort of say, okay, if we write this, what would this mean to this person? Or if we're trying to plan an event automatically, if we make this step, what'll be the next step? Oh, that'll cause a problem here. We do this all the time. And so there are now models like this being built. The big example from a couple years ago was Meta built a model that could win at the game diplomacy. And the way it worked is it had a language model for the talking and a simulation model for the let's try out different moves. Anyways, the engineer who built that, Noam Brown, OpenAI hired him away last year. And he's really working on building out a whole suite of these sort of planning models to work with the language models. That's going to be the innovation that I think is going to have the big impact on knowledge work productivity. Those like smaller language models talking to other bespoke models that we understand well as well. That's when suddenly I won't have to check my inbox for this, or I can offload, can you go through the steps required to submit this reimbursement form? So that's what I'm keeping an eye on. So yeah, GPT-4 can't do that. And it's not going to be GPT-5 or 6. It's going to be GPT plus some other types of models that's going to make the big difference.
Exciting. I'm really interested in how AI potentially changes what we think about, in this case, about productivity. So not just how do we produce the things that we're trying to do now better, faster, more efficiently, get rid of some of those things, but does it change fundamentally our concept of productivity? And when I think about in education and higher ed, what we're doing is there an opportunity or a way for us to start thinking about what AI will mean for what we're able to do, not just how we do the same things that we've been trying to do for the longest time? What is that transformational moment that AI brings? And maybe it's the ensemble model, but how do we start to really reimagine and rethink some of the things that we value right now in education, in productivity, in order to see AI as a tool that augments our work, but also transforms it?
It's field specific, right? So for example, my field, I'm a theoretical computer scientist. It's like my sort of main academic home, which is mainly proofs. So like math and logic proofs. A place in that field where AI could be really change the way we do our work. Like for someone like me, who's like an applied mathematician, the biggest obstacle I have is math ability, right? Like, because what will happen is this is through all the sciences that use math. You're trying to prove something or model something or mathematically get to some truth, and you end up with a mess of complicated equations. And all of theoretical physics, all of theoretical computer science is like, I need to make sense of these. And then I just have to use all these tools of math I've learned to try to tame these or bound these and sort of get some sort of interesting result out of it. These ensemble models, really mathematics is a planning game, but these ensemble models might be able to, for example, help with that. So now as a computer scientist, okay, here I've set up the analysis. I think this is the right algorithm. Here's the bound for its performance, but it's a messy equation. Hey, help me simplify this. That could unlock a completely different notion of how work unfolds. Like we forget that Einstein, it took him a while to finish general relativity because relative to other theoretical physicists, he wasn't very good at math. I mean, he was good at math compared to like the normal person, but he wasn't at the cutting edge of mathematics, and he had to work with Gross and learn Riemann geometry. So it took him a long time to learn the math. That he just needed, his theories were original, but he needed to learn this math to sort of establish them. So this would be a case where if you had one of these ensemble models, they could have helped him with the math part, and he could have just focused on, he would have had general relativity faster. But we don't have those models yet. The place in academia where I think we already have this transformation happening is paper writing in the humanities, right? I mean, I think this is what models as they exist today can do interesting disruptive work. And so I think this is really the sort of focal point of, we have a new conception on how some sort of intellectual activity happens. And I think there's a lot of interesting thought to be done here about how do we even describe and call this sort of interactive, almost interpersonal process we observe when students are working with these models to write. I read an academic paper on this recently where they just watched a bunch of YouTube videos of people showing how to use ChatGPT to write papers and just categorized the things they did. And it was like 55 different behaviors. Their categorization system had 55 behaviors that were grouped into like 12 larger behaviors. So I think this is the place. I think paper writing in particular is the place where the first major reconceptualizations of some sort of like intellectual activity in a world of AI might be happening.
I mean, we are such content producers right now. We write so much in our current sort of state as human beings in this world, this technical world. And maybe it starts to change, what is actually produced. And I have this sort of inkling, this sense that we're going to become hopefully better readers than writers at some point, and that our job will be to be better in judging and understanding what's happening and being produced, maybe than producing a lot of content that may not be all that helpful. So
there's also this rule that seems to be out here right now, people who are like really thinking seriously about this, which is like one of the iron law of writing with AI is that AI can't write better than you, right? Because it turns out it's a very sort of editorial type of process. You're bringing the sense of taste and correctness that you're then sort of working with the AI to help produce drafts or this or that. But there's a famous case of this novelist who wrote a whole novel using AI. And as he reported back, he's like, this ChatGPT can't write a novel better than me because I'm the one who has to direct it. So there's this other interesting question of like the taste, like what is good, what is not good, what's a good argument, what's good writing, what's good style. That still has to, at least right now, be like we are the ultimate redactor still in these interactions. So it's kind of like an interesting rule that's emerging. I can't use ChatGPT to produce better writing than I can write. If I try really hard, I can eventually get it to produce something that's like seems like something I wrote, but it can't surpass me.
Really great. Thank you. So I think at this point, we're going to open it up for questions, and we have mics that can roam, and Molly has some of the questions that came in through the registration. So just happy to call on folks.
Hi, I'm Ken Mayer. I'm in UIS. I have a question. I was really inspired by your account of the master's report writer who was like using ChatGPT almost as a colleague or for emotional support. And I was thinking that, computers have brought efficiency to a whole bunch of sectors of the economy, but famously not to education and healthcare. And we know that both doctors and healthcare workers, as well as healthcare consumers and patients, hunger for more personal interaction. They don't have much time. And I'm wondering if this use of ChatGPT is also a reflection that people don't feel that they have enough one-on-one personal interaction. I know I benefited from having consultations, tutorials with a professor who was from the British system. So we met with each of us once a week, and sort of steered us through projects. And I'm just wondering if this is, answering a need or a lack in our educational system.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes. I think it's one of the things that definitely came out of the research I've been doing recently is that there's a loneliness that maybe we don't always recognize as educators. There's a certain loneliness to like university level academic work, right? Because I mean, our whole model is this sort of monastic model of you go to your like library and you sit there and you think, and those of us who do this for a living love that. But for a lot of people, it is, stressful. It's unnatural. We're social beings. I mean, which I guess that makes us antisocial. I don't know, a bunch of curmudgeons. But I definitely got that out of it. The other thing I got out of it is especially, I mean, in Georgetown, we have sort of students that are sort of elite students that are from backgrounds they're sort of used to. They have expectations for what the education experience is going to be like. But, I was talking to students from all around the world from different circumstances. There's a real anxiety with college level academic work as well, that there was some sort of a anxiety reduction function that was coming from the models, that just the sense of having someone to talk to. So I think it is showing a lack of, you can come to an institution and sort of just be on your own, at least when it comes to like the intellectual journey, and that a lot of students, I think, it's stressful or it's lonely or it's alienating. So it tells me that's interaction we could be having more with the students. I don't think having a chatbot do it is probably the final answer, but the fact they're turning to it, I think it's really meaningful.
There was a story maybe a year ago now of a study that had been done between responses from ChatGPT and physicians. I think it was in New York, assessing the empathy on each of their responses. And ChatGPT had proven to be more empathetic in its responses than the physicians. And so, at some level, whether or not it's going to replace us, it'll force us to be at least more human as we interact with each other. So. The questions? Jay, I think I saw your hand up. Yeah.
I was interested in how you brought up audience and talking about writing for the New Yorker and sort of needing to adapt your language, versus when writing as a computer scientist. And so I wonder, either from your own experiences with large language models or from these really fascinating observations and interviews with students using them, do you have advice for ways that large language models might be helpful in adapting writing to particular audiences, ways they might not be? Sort of, what are some of your thoughts on kind of audience and large language models?
Yeah, I mean, that's something the models seem to be good at, right? Like that's right in the DNA of how these models work, that you can give it example text and then say, rewrite what I just wrote here, in this style. Like the models are very good. And I actually do think this is an important function, right? Because, it's another thing I've learned is when I'm studying like college students writing papers, what's being left out of this is just like in the world of business, communication is really critical. And this is like a real differentiating factor of like, I just need to send an email to someone to request something, or I'm talking to a potential client. And there is a huge amount of subtlety in terms of the proper code switching for this is exactly the sort of the right tone to use when addressing this type of audience. This is a place where I think language models are actually showing to potentially have like a really positive benefit. So in particular, like Grammarly has really embraced using language models in the Grammarly plugin. And one of the features they've really been able to amplify is tone detection, which turns out, like if you talk to them, it's like this really useful function. Like it can tell you like, okay, this tone is like this. You want it more like this. And it's right there in the app. Like I'm writing this email or what have you. So I think this is like one of the subtle places where broad impact could come from these models is those of us who write for a living we care and think a lot about exactly how we express ourselves, and we don't realize how much we're tailoring it. And this is like right up the alleyway of these models. Like that's what it does. I have this text and I'm using this to influence my token prediction. It's very, very good at mimicking styles.
The end of all passive aggressive emails, I think might be coming. So
So there's this the study I uncovered. It's not famous at all, but I always think about it when I wrote my book about email a few years ago. They measured both the sender and receiver of an email. How confident are you that the recipient is going to like understand what you mean? And the senders were like super confident. Like, yeah, it's clear. Like I'm kind of like joking here, this or that. And the receivers, of course, were always misunderstanding it. And there's this huge mismatch where it's very difficult to actually have emotionally accurate linguistic communication. It's why, like during the great epistolatory traditions of the past centuries, if you look at, George Washington's letters to Martha Washington, there's like pages of flowery text. It's because it's really hard to try to set a cognitive context for text. So when you're writing an email as fast as you possibly can, not only is it completely misunderstood, but the sender, because the sender knows what they mean. To the sender, it couldn't be any clearer that they're telling a joke or whatever. And then on the other side, people are throwing so you're right. Maybe that'll save us from the misunderstood email.
in the language of every literature professor in here, I think, the challenge of understanding that. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm Pam Saunders. My home is the neurology department, and I'm a linguist by training. So you're hitting all of the interesting spots for me. I must tell you, I am trying hard to teach doctors to be empathetic. So one person at a time. As you were speaking, the issue of bias keeps coming to mind. So who is deciding what is empathetic? And if we start early with some set of conceptions, is it culturally relevant? Is it cross-culturally relevant? And then as these models get bigger and learn more and build, are we just baking it in? Thank you.
I mean, yes and yes. I think like where are these things, like where are these labels coming from? Like this is empathetic, this or not. Almost all of that is going to be human in the loop reinforcement learning, right? So they train the big model, they spend $100 million to do it. This is all unsupervised. The actual training of the core models, the structure is super simple, right? It takes a piece of real text, it drops out a word from the real text. It gives all the text up to that dropped out word, and it says the model, like, figure out what word was there before. The model makes a guess, and then it uses back propagation to tweak the weights in it so that it's like a little bit better. And then they just do that like hundreds of billions of times, right? That gives you your base model. But the base models they can produce really interesting, great stuff, but they're hard to get it out of it. So then they do a lot of this reinforcement learning where you're not retraining the model from scratch, but you're sort of tweaking, especially at the top and bottom layers. You're tweaking it with reinforcement learning driven by humans. So humans saying this is good, this is bad. So it's like a taser shock to the model. Like that's a bad answer. And it like really will change the weights to like stay away from those type of answers. Or this is a good answer and like it really will affect the weight. So like it really will bias towards those type of answers. So this is a big part of how they call it fine tuning, but it's just like whoever they can affordably hire to sit and just like click these yes or no buttons. As far as I understand, like the way these things work is they're like at OpenAI, for example, they just sort of come up with some arbitrary, I mean, not arbitrary, but like without a real process behind it, some sort of metric for measuring something they care about. And then they run the model, and if it does bad on this metric, they go and have just like people from around the world, just in cubicles, like do all this reinforcement learning until like the numbers get better on that metric they care about. It's very haphazard right now. This is not a controlled thing, and we see we see the sensitivity of these models to this training. I mean, I think this was the issue Google had with their consumer-facing Gemini model is, these reinforcement signals, because it's just like a few 100,000 signals on a model that's trained on trillions of whatever, right? And so they have huge impact. And so you try to change one thing, and then you have completely different changes happen, right? At OpenAI, when we were out there last year, they told us, for example, a few years ago, they trained it early ChatGPT. They're like, oh, we just have these obvious examples of like really hateful rhetoric, and press no and zap it on these. Now it won't produce this. It did well on the metric, but then it refused basically to talk at all about Donald Trump, because like a lot of the stuff he was saying, it fell into this thing that was getting zapped, and like, oh no, we can't have a model that doesn't talk about the current president. So then they had to go in and train it back the other way, and it's just like kind of haphazard seesawing back and forth, which is all to say this is the problem with having a massive model that you want to do all things, that you don't understand the model and that you're throwing this reinforcement learning at it, is that that piece of it's really uncontrolled.
It also seems the issue of what is going in to train the model in the first place, even before you get the reinforcement, is going to create a particular kind of bias as well, right? So the cultural biases of the texts that are actually being used to train. So it's significant challenges, and we certainly see this when it produces art, particular kinds of ways, right? Our cultural biases get represented and reinforced in the productions of these texts. So.
We have a question from the chat, sorry, here in the back. So there's a bit of a concern about people who use metaphors of teaching and learning with respect to their interactions with ChatGPT. For example, I'm teaching it what I want to get out of it. It's learning from my prompts. This correlates with the anthropomorphizing, of this tool. What's some better language we can use to talk about AI in order to push back on these humanizing metaphors and remind people that there's no mind/emotion or learning behind these tools?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is definitely something that's happening. I think because it's language, right? Because it's like we don't have the same problem with other Gen AI tools, right? Like people don't humanize DALL-E, right? Image generators, we see that as like, yeah, this is a tool that is like somehow taking in this text and doing some sort of computer stuff, and like a picture comes out the other side. But when we hear language, we uniquely assign language to human consciousness. So, look, I've tried this. This was like that New Yorker piece. I was pushing back at this because there was this idea, the way it was being described in late 2022 was an alien mind, right? It was like this mind, and we have to understand this mind. And I was saying it's not a mind, it's matrices. One of the things I'll just say this one point. One of the things that's interesting is computer scientists, not people who are at these tech companies, but just academic computer scientists who study AI, tend not to do this much. They also tend to have like very little doomerism, academic computer scientists aren't worried about super intelligence and, Terminator scenarios. And they tend to seem really conservative on this in a way that surprises tech journalists, because I work in both worlds. I think part of what's going on there is that the AI academic community, when they think about these models, what they imagine is matrices on a GPU being multiplied. Like they understand what's happening under the surface is big tables of numbers being multiplied by other big tables of numbers a lot of times. And then in the end, you have a big table of numbers and a Python program. It looks at that and picks out a word to output. So somehow, and this has kind of been my program of trying to open the black box a little bit. Computer scientists have that black box really open, so they don't name the models. Like they know it's matrices on GPUs. So maybe that's one way that helps here is finding ways to open that black box without getting too technical. Because when you open the black box, like this is interesting technology, but I don't think of it in the way I think of like another person.
It's also, interestingly, a uniquely human thing that we do. We anthropomorphize everything, right? So it's one of the ways in which we probably show how we interact with the world and then to do it to the tool that we shouldn't be doing it to is a fascinating problem. Yep.
Melissa from the McDonough School of Business. So going back a bit to the linguist question, topics like race, class, power, justice, they are not globally aligned. And when you think about the business models getting to scale, it's about that assumption that all is the same across the globe. So a two-part question, is there a financial incentive for them to be nuanced and go back and do yes, no, based on these contexts? Or should we just say AI should not be used in certain constructs?
It's a great question. I think that their financial incentive, they see this general purpose chatbot as it's PR and it's kind of a burden they wish they didn't have to deal with. It's not the future these companies want. Their model is not, we should have an oracle that like all things you do, you talk to this oracle, and somehow this like one massive model that costs $1 billion to train, like everything uses it. The business model they want is this to be like much more bespoke. And, you know, I have a particular model, ensemble of models that does spreadsheet stuff for me. I don't have to worry about, you know, issues of like race representation. It creates spreadsheet tiles. And here's another model that like just helps me answer emails, and it's really good at university emails, and like that's what it does. That's where they want to get. So what happened to OpenAI is this was their model. So they had GPT-3, which could do all this great stuff, but was people weren't using it because it was kind of hard to use. You had to be very careful in how you prompted it. But their whole model was, no, you're going to build tools on top of this. And then the tool will like do all the careful work of prompting it. And then the tool will be like a spreadsheet tool, or it'll be a like Grammarly type plugin. But they wanted to get more attention to this. They're like, well, here's what we'll do. We'll build a demo application, a chatbot. We'll call it ChatGPT. And we'll do some reinforcement learning to make it like particularly good at answering questions. And this will just show the world, oh, there's lots of cool stuff you can do with one of these models. Instead, that became the whole game. And 100 million people signed up to use the chat demo. They lost a huge amount of equity because they couldn't, of course, pay the server bills for this. And Microsoft came along and said, we'll rip up your server bill, but we get a large chunk of your equity. And that's how Microsoft got into the AI business. It's not the business they want to be in. They do not want general purpose chat bots. It's a nightmare business for them. What they want is smaller, bespoke, high profit margin systems that sort of use this technology.
Hi, I'm Sumegha Asthana, and I'm very curious. I don't know if it's already been covered, but I'm curious about the tools to detect AI-generated material. A lot of my assignments are about blogs and papers, and my special interest is to know what kind of inputs were made. I don't mind students revising language through AI. The best that I know is Zero GTP, and I have used text multiple times, showing different results each time. Are there any advancements to know what kind of inputs were put in?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Eddie, I'll turn to you on if you know about the particular tools. I know you've looked into them.
We've spent some time, not only have we spent some time, but we've been watching what other people are doing to try to research and understand the plagiarism detection tools. And so far, everything that I've seen, and I think that we've seen, is that they are not good. You cannot trust them. But I also just go back to what we were talking about earlier in the kind of transactional model of using AI. In many respects, if that's all a student is doing, you might get a reasonable result from some of the detection tools if they just simply put in a prompt and then they return something. But even there, it's pretty weak. But that's not how students are using the tools, right? They're using it in much more complex and sophisticated ways. And it's virtually impossible to tell if you're taking a sentence and asking the sentence to be rewritten, and then incorporating it into something larger that you're producing in different kinds of ways. If you're playing that editorial role, it becomes much more of a complicated writing process than simply saying, you know, give me an answer to this prompt. And I think that's actually how we want them to use these tools. I imagine it's probably how we all use these tools right now, whether that's Grammarly or some other response tools or language tools that we're using in our own writing. And so helping them understand how to use them in more sophisticated ways, I think is where we want to go, rather than assuming we have the ability to detect what we traditionally called plagiarism, which is likely going to have to change just as a concept. because our understanding of what plagiarism was based on a very different kind of notion, maybe even a wrong notion of what writing is in general. And so we probably need to continue to adapt that as well. But the short answer, after a long one, is they're terrible, and you shouldn't probably rely on them to do anything, I think.
Hello, hello. So maybe this question gets to the heart of what everyone's thinking. What is the future of the academic paper as a assignment assessment tool? Does that have a future? And faculty I deal with are turning to blue books, just getting rid of research papers entirely. Does it require a revolution in pedagogy? Just some feedback would be helpful.
It's got a future, or do you want the
Yeah,
answer to be it doesn't?
A nice, simple, to the point. Yeah. No, please elaborate.
Like Oxford style tutorials. If I had to guess, I mean, my current guess is it's not that different looking than today. I think the standards for the papers will be higher. I mean, ultimately, like this is probably the right reaction. Is you raise the standards of what you're asking students to do, and feel free to use these tools if it's going to help you. And then maybe it's less papers, but I'm really going to like read it and get into the nuance of your argument. And the tools might help you, but there's no way to avoid actually. I mean, ChatGPT is not great at producing original arguments. It's good at summarizing arguments or particular forms of arguments. So I wouldn't be surprised if the future was just the standards are higher on papers, but we're still writing papers. And maybe there's like some component of non-paper piece evaluation, which would make it really hard if you didn't really understand what you were doing. I mean, I mentioned student tutorials, but this is like the Oxford model too. It's like there's this, you write the paper, but you sit there and you basically argue about it with the tutor. Like you explain it and you go back and forth. It's like a doctoral oral exam. You know, we have the same problem in mathematics right now because I teach sort of intro mathematics to CS majors. Intro mathematics is pretty tractable to ChatGPT because it's seen a lot of these problems before, and it's very good at knowing like you just change things, but it's basically this type of problem. And so like math has changed a little bit where it's, well, you have this in-class, there's like the in-class evaluation. And if you're just relying on these tools for the stuff we're assigning for home, you're gonna have a really hard time. So there's some hybrid stuff happening. I don't think the paper's going away. I mean, you've been seeing these projects from the initiative. So I don't know if you're seeing, I was going to ask you about if you've been seeing anything like particularly new.
So talking about our initiative on pedagogical uses of AI, and I don't think we're actually seeing anything dramatically new right now, because I think we're still in a very liminal space of trying to adapt to these tools and what these tools might mean. But I do think it's an interesting thought exercise to ask yourself, well, what would it mean if the academic paper went away? What would that look like? How would we understand the representation of knowledge or understanding? I mean, writing as a representation of knowledge is at least in the history of human beings, is a relatively recent thing to begin with. And so we could imagine a second age of orality, for example, where we're starting to really rethink how we understand and engage with concepts and represent those concepts and represent our understanding. Would that be the worst thing? I don't know. I mean, I think it's certainly something we're probably going to have to struggle with. We're going to have to think about, I mean, all of our concepts, plagiarism, what it means to produce content and knowledge and represent that knowledge, what its role in thinking is. I have colleagues who, for them, writing is the way in which they think, right? It's a way of producing ideas. Is that the same for everybody? Is that going to change? Are we asking something from students where we could create more bespoke versions of representation of knowledge because students now have a different set of tools? I think these are going to be questions we're going to have to struggle with. We're not doing so right now, though. Right now, I think we're just trying to figure out, what is this new calculator doing to our study of this thing, and how do we use this tool in a way that is helping us reproduce what we're already doing? But eventually, we probably will have to really start to reimagine some of that.
Hi, I'm a data scientist in the SFS. And it seems like there's sort of this progress or culture war going on within the private sector to produce AI the fastest, to produce AI, maybe in a sustainable way, maybe not. But all of these companies are sort of duking it out. And I'm wondering what you think the role of academia is in this context. So, is it to stop the private sector and say, hey, wait a second, what you're doing is kind of crazy? Or is it to just kind of sit back and watch what happens? Should academia be producing AI research themselves and taking it to these private sector companies and saying, hey, we have more updated research than you do? I'm just kind of curious what your take on academia is in the context of the private sector.
Well, I mean, there's one idea. If we look for a comparable example, we can look at what was happening with biotechnology, right? Especially in the late 20th, early 21st century. Biotechnology breakthroughs were largely being funded by these super well-funded private companies. Georgetown enters the scene. Georgetown does a lot of the sort of cultural legwork on trying to understand what bioethics means as a field, right? We get with the Kennedy Institute and some other initiatives. Georgetown helped figure out an ethical framework for bioethics, which was then actually pretty influential into how the private sector bioethics unfolded. So that's one place. That's actually something Georgetown is doing. I'm one of the founding faculty members of this new Center for Digital Ethics, here at Georgetown. That is the model. We should have people who are thinking about these thoughts, these normative questions around this technology. There is a hunger for those ideas. So that's one place I think we might have an academic influence.
That's great.
Hi, my name is Dave Zovak, and I work in the Career Center, School of Foreign Service. One of the things that I've wondered about is just the way AI is potentially impacting thinking skills, critical thinking skills, because that's certainly something that employers are looking for. And I'm curious what research or you're discovering about how, if at all, it is changing the way students are learning. One example I can give is that my young adult children grew up with using like GPS on their phone. I grew up with map books. And so when I go to a new environment, I look for the map, I create a map in my head. That doesn't seem to be something my kids or their generation does. I don't know if one's better or worse, but it is a different model in place. Any comments about how AI and AI tools may impact the way or the quality of learning?
I mean, I think it's a fascinating question. I don't think we have the answer yet. You're right. We've seen this time and again. GPS was a good example. Google has had a massive impact on sort of the way cognition happens. This idea of like information being at our fingertips that like we adapted to in a way that really changed things. So I don't know of research that's pointing towards the definitive answer there. Right now, we're not going to see huge effects just because it's so new, but right, looking ahead to like as this becomes more integrated into our day-to-day, the one thing I have an eye on that I'm just curious about has to do with, I guess we could call it like concentration ability. So part of what we see when we look at students writing, for example, is they're getting a relief from cognitive strain. So when you write we'll check with the neuroscientists, but when you write, I've been reading these neuroscience papers on the neuroscience of writing. It's an incredibly difficult cognitive task because you have to actually sort of chain together multiple different types of working memory modalities. You have like visual working memory and textual working memory, and you have to sort of put them all on the same task of translating thought in the written word. And what I'm seeing is ChatGPT relieves some of that strain. It's like an extension of your working memories. So if I give it a paragraph and then it gives it back and I ask it to change a sentence, there's much less I have to hold in my head. There's much less I have to do, I think of as conceptual mapping. I hold a concept here, look at this concept, connect it back. That's at the core of sort of really deep creative thought. I mean, when I wrote that book about deep work years ago, I really got into really sort of complicated cognitive production. And really it is a game of you hold things in your working memory and you test hypothesis and you bring this over here. It's possible that'll get weakened, right? So there's a hypothesis that I don't know if it's true or not of writing serving the role of cognitive calisthenics. You write a bunch of college, you come out of college, you know the stuff you wrote about, but also your brain is in better shape now. And it's more comfortable now when I'm dealing with another type of complex problem for which I don't have a language model, it's not relevant. You're just more comfortable keeping these abstract elements in your mind. That's just a hypothesis, so I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the type of thing it's worth keeping a finger on.
Yeah, it's fascinating. When I spent a lot of my career reading really long novels, and when you stop reading really long novels to teach, you lose an endurance for reading really long novels. It's much harder to go back and read something that's 1,000 pages at some point.
Hi, Glenn Williamson. I'm in the real estate program at SES. We have a lot of faculty in our program, and we talk a lot here about teaching students with ChatGPT or these other tools. I'm just curious, Candles does a lot to teach faculty. Have you put any kind of pilot stuff together to try and use this stuff to teach faculty?
Absolutely. So we have resources online. We've been running workshops. Molly has been running a number of workshops on using the tools. We've had workshops here at the Summer Institute both this year and last year on using the tools. And then the initiative on pedagogical uses of AI is trying to help work with people to kind of think about how they implement these tools into their work. So we're doing as much as we can in this space. It's right now probably one of our key areas of effort. And
yeah, I'm gonna stand because I sit very behind. So I got really inspired by what you said earlier about the interactive nature of ChatGPT. And in the most recent model they released in the 4.0, there's this video feature. There's a camera. And I'm just wondering, like, what's your thought on this, where this is going? And, what if I know it's able to read into facial expressions, environment, and what does that mean as opportunities and threats to our education?
Yeah, I mean, the multimodal turn is very interesting, right? Where it can you can take a picture as input to the model. You can talk to the model. For example, the model can produce pictures. The model can produce spoken text. As Scarlett Johansson learned, you can produce spoken text that sounds a lot like you. Just like a key technical term, like interesting piece to all of that is the core language model is not being changed in this multimodal turn. There's different models being sort of bolted onto it, models that are sort of less cutting edge. So when we add like image input to GPT-4, what they really did is took a long existing image recognition neural network that is just very good at describing images. And then what happens is like you give this picture to the LLM, roughly speaking, this smaller model that's not super innovative, but good, like describes the picture in words, which you could then give as input to the existing language model. Same thing when you talk to these models, there's like a not so exciting voice to text model that they just tacked on, and everything gets turned into text. I mean, it's not quite true. It gets turned into sort of embeddings but whatever. Basically, it gets turned into text, and then it goes into the model like you would any other text. And then the models that generate things like images and voice are completely different models than the GPT model. So there's like a lot of what's happening now has not been changing the core language model, but tacking on other types of models. But I guess your question though is like, how does this affect pedagogy? The image thing is a big deal, I think, right? I've been seeing a lot of examples of this. You can like sketch a picture of something. You can sketch a flow chart. Like I'm thinking about building a computer program, and like these will be the pieces, and then it can work with that. It can write code that then matches like what you wrote. You can take diagrams, and then you can ask it questions. You can give it charts. This is another big one. I mean, be wary about doing data analysis with a language model, but you can give it charts. I think that's interesting. The voice. Tacking on the voice is important too, because that's a much better interface than having to type. The big problem with the voice right now is the voice model is fast, but GPT, the language model, is slow, and it's too slow to be useful, right? It's too slow. If I talk to it, it sits there and it computes, and then it gives the answer. So this is part of why like OpenAI's huge initiative right now is smaller models. Like they're building the really big next model that's costing $1 billion. It's all PR. Because like what they need is like a much smaller model that can sit on your phone so that when you talk to it, it can like instantaneously get you a response back. And you can't do that with 1 trillion parameters. 1 trillion parameters takes like multiple GPUs just to generate a single token. So I think multimodal, ironically, you feel like you're making these models more capable is probably going to lead to these models getting much smaller so that like it can integrate into our life a lot more.
We probably have time for maybe one more question. Okay. Oh, we solved the AI problem. I think we're all.
Builds nicely. I've heard some of your colleagues in the computer science department talk about some core understandings of what we need students to now understand about AI terms, machine learning, deep learning, unsupervised learning, supervised learning. What are your thoughts on sort of a core curriculum or understanding so students can approach these tools critically? Do you think that is a role that the university should be playing in connecting students with an understanding of these tools?
Right now, my department chair somewhere is sweating. Like, wait, are we going to have to teach a course to the entire university? I think it's a really interesting idea. The problem right now, I think, is the fast-moving nature of it. Maybe that's an opportunity, not a problem. But I think the core question there is like, how useful is it to really understand the terminology of AI? That's interesting because it's, you know what it's starting to feel a lot like now is when we realized a decade or two ago, we really need to understand statistical terminology because so much of it's a data world now and so much what we encounter is actually data analysis and that matters. So that's an interesting concept. I mean, whether that's its own course or this becomes like a non-trivial piece of the sort of existing CS, like non-major service course, whatever, it's an interesting idea, just sort of knowing there's different types of AI and there's language models and there's recognizer models and there's reinforcement learning and there's unsupervised learning. And in the end, there is matrices just multiplying. I think it's an interesting idea. Yeah. I'm not available to teach it though. I think I checked, my thing is full.
Well, isn't AI going to free up all your time, right? You can learn to play the guitar, teach some extra classes.
Yeah, not my time, everyone else's time. I'm still busy. Yeah.
Let's get us away from that anthropomorphizing, right? If you can start to understand the terms, you can understand the limitations, you can understand why things hallucinate or why it's producing what it's producing and what you can expect of it. So I do think there's some value in trying to at least look under the hood.